pwa do mo wa ba le khu lo kwi we no a pho si pho de lo tni ble pho ti pha ni
I said, I have seen a lot of people suffer a lot of loss.
no ta pati ba pwa a ga tu ba kho ba le a pho ti pha no hi pho lo ma di ni
I said, the difference between me and you
ta le a lo so ra ta do na ba se ni
is that I have walked with people through their losses.
ta me pwa le ta le ba ta ko ta o ta ko ba do pwa le hi pho lo ma ti pha
And you have not.
ba sa ne ne to bu do wa tin de le kho pro bu do wa tin not blo ba
So I have a wisdom about life in God
no le pata ba ka ba o da ta ku se no ba o da ta se nya na pa kha le pata o mu le ka sa ywa ni
that you do not have.
no ba se sa pa o ni ba se ne to o ne to ba
I said, someday you may have the wisdom I have.
no ba mi ti ni ne ka pa la ba di so ta ku se we kha ma ne ka hi ba ne ka ni sa ba ne ka do ne ba ta ku se di le ne ta o mu bu
I said, maybe when you go back to England,
ba se phe ne ki ga ki le England ne
your husband,
do ne no wa da ga
who is sitting next to you,
chin no phe ne ka pa ga ni
will get cancer.
do we me do ne ba ba cancer
And you will pray and pray and pray for him,
no ne ka ba tu ka pa le lu pi le wa
and he will die.
ba sa do we si we da
And through that great loss in your life,
no le ta lo ma kwi phat do di de kli le ta mu pu ne
you may know what I know.
no ne ka sin nya do de ka plo ba di ta plo ba ke so
I said, I'm not saying I hope your husband dies,
that me le ta te le na wa ka ba si ba
but if you do suffer that great loss,
no ba sa ne me tu ba ta lo ma di i ba ro
you will know more about
ne
God.
ka sin nya ba ka sa yu me ka sa ma ta le ne lo
She was not happy,
we ta sa mu we ba
but I still believe that is the right thing to say.
ta chu mo le akre ka te le ta ba hi ta si se ja ne lo mo
To say to somebody, you have experienced this loss,
no pa ne ka te ba pa da ga le a le kho plo ba ta o sa di ne
because you do not have enough faith,
ne te o le si tu ne ka le te pa le wa si ta ne ta na to ba
is a cruel thing to say.
awe ni me ta kha le rasa de do ba le ne te pa di ni lo
Because Jesus left most of the sick people around him
angi le ka sa shu kri pe he o mu kha ni awe pa ti we no pa do du le ta ma bla we ba ni o do du lo
unhealed.
le ta ma bla we o do du lo
And Paul writes about his thorn in the flesh.
do so pa lu kwe we se ko le no ta shi ta me o le a phi nya kla ni
We don't know what that was.
pa ti nya ba ta gi we ni
But Paul says, time after time I prayed
so pa lu te ba ye ba ti ga pa de blow the blow
that God would deliver me from this.
le ka sa yu a ke ma pu wi ya le kha me ta su ta sa ta kwa sa me we ni
And God did not do that.
pa sa da ka sa ya ta ma we ba de we
But God did say to Paul,
pa sa ka sa yu a te ba so pa lu le
in your weakness I am made strong.
le ne ta gi si ba sa pu ni no ye du ke ra na le pa su lo
Through loss in our lives,
no le pa ta u mu ta kwa sa me le ta lo ma pu ni
we experience the power of God.
pa le khop lo ba yu a ata so ta ko mo te pa ni lo
So if God did not answer the prayer of the Apostle Paul,
ka sa yu a te si se we so pa lu ata thu ka pa ata khi ba
there's no promise he's going to answer all our prayers.
a we khop le te me le ka sa yu a le ta gi we ni ko te me le ka sa te si se ta thu pa lo wa le ba te me ja ni ba
Because Paul was a person of great faith.
no a gi le so pa lu me pa le o ta na pha do da lo
Loss is a part of life.
no ta lo ma ni me ta u mu we le pa ta u mu me ta ta no ta gi ta no lo
And prayer is not magic by which we protect ourselves from loss.
ta le ta thu ka pha ni te me pe de le mye le le a ka ma pha mye le le ka do the pa ta u mu ka ma bi ma ba ta u mu te me ni se ko ba
Okay, any questions or comments about any of that?
ke ta si kwa do ta te no ta hik no o te mi mya ya ke maybe she want to ask about the question may not be in the program Jane
Sure.
that kind of he wants to ask is not the term the people who speak in turn is maybe probably in the Corinthian
Oh yes, in 1 Corinthians.
it is what is what the meaning of that what
Okay, let's do this several steps at a time.
no me ba ga o the blue paton nya ma no
On the day of Pentecost in the book of Acts,
နော်လေအဝဲဖန်ဒီကောပတယ်လေသဘူးဆော့ဘူးနော်ဘူးဆော့စီဖဲမာတာဘူးနေ
people spoke in foreign languages,
နော်ပါဖန်ဒီပါစစ်တပါဒီကတူရလေကလူကလိုကမနော်
languages they did not know.
လေကလိုလေဝစစ်တနာပွဲဝနေ
The Bible said they spoke in foreign tongues.
နော်လီဆိုတယ်လေဝစစ်ကတူဝလေကလိုကလေကလူကလိုနော်ကလူကကလိုတဲ့
That was a one-time thing.
နော်ဖန်ဒီမိဝတာတမတာတဘလောအလော
And we can set that aside. That's not what was happening in the Corinthian church.
နော်တခါနေအဒီပကပါလောချောပတေခမေပတေအဒိုနခါနေပပါလောချောလေအကေရတာတဘလောဖန်ဒီပတေဟက်ကီဒီပတ်ထွာဒကရိစုဘွာ
In Corinth, people were speaking in a prayer language.
နော်ပပမလေကရိစုဘွာနေပွာစစ်တပကတူရလေနော်တထူကဖကလော
It was not a language. It was not a known language.
What is that?
It was not a known language.
အဝဲဘက်ကလောတခါလေတတသိညာဝါမဖနေ
It was becoming a problem in the church in Corinth.
နော်အဝဲဟကေရတာတကောရခေကေရတာလေလေတခါနေကိုတကေရတကောရခေကေရလေလေကရိစုတောက်ဖို့ဘူးနေ
It was becoming disruptive in the worship service.
နော်အဝဲမတီတာဝဲတာလေတဘူတာဘာအတာရကေရတကောရခေရဘာတီတာလေတဘူတာဘာအတာရလောအတာရကလေဘူးနေ
Paul talks about this in chapter 14 of 1 Corinthians.
စပလူတေဝဘခါလေတာဂိဝဲလေတေကရိစုခုတ်စီလူဘူးနေ
He makes this suggestion.
အဝဲဟေကူဝဲဘခါတာဝဲတာဂိဝဲနေ
He says, worship, we should help one another in worship.
ဘာဆလို့တာသေးမတကလေတဘူတာဘာတာတဘူတာဘာကတော့နေပကေရတာမဆတကသေး
So if I'm speaking in an unknown prayer language,
အဒိုယကတူရလေ not ကလိုလေဝတ်တတူပါဘူးလေကလိုလေဝတ်နာပပါ
he says you're talking to God. Nobody else knows what you're saying.
နော်နကတူရလေကစားရလားမတာမတနာပနတာပါ
So does that help anybody else in the room?
ဘာသာဝကေရတာမဆစစ်ကိုလေပါလေနော်ကနာရဖဲတာခါမေဒခံဖလက်ဒီပူနော်ဒဖလက်ဒီပူ
No.
နော်တကေရဘာနော်ကဘနေ
So he says other people have the gift of interpretation.
နော်မေပါအဂတ်အဂတ်တိပါတော့ကိုအိုတော့နော်တာဟီလေမေဝဲတာတေကလိုဒါ
So I'm speaking in a prayer language.
ဒိုဝဲကတူဒါလေတာထူကဖကလို
Thra then interprets what I'm saying.
နော်ဒိုယေယကလိုထီနော်လေအခေါမျိုးမတမတလည်းနေ
And he tells you all what I'm saying.
နော်အဝဲတဲပြကီဝသူလေအခေါမျိုးတိမတမတလည်းနေ
Paul says that's helpful to everybody.
နော်အဝဲနေမတလည်းအကဲဘလူလေပွာအားကဟောလော
But if nobody interprets what I'm saying,
အဒိုအဝဲတဲဝဲခဲရီတော့ပတက်ကလိုဒါမေတိုနော်ကလေပကနာပေါ်ကဘာနေ
it doesn't help anybody.
ခမေတကေရတာဘလဖို့နော်မီဝါမနော်
So in that case, I should shut up.
နော်မေတာလေမေဒီနေယဘိတေဘာဂီလောမဝတနာပနော်ကယဘိတေဘာနေဂီလောမ
You can read all of this in chapter 14.
နော်အဝဲနေပဖာဖဲတစီလူဘူးသေးလောမ
He's saying if nobody is there to interpret it,
နော်ခမေပွာတကလေအတေရလေကလိုတခါတော့ပွာတဲကလိုနော်ဘေတူအဘနော်တကဘာနေ
I ought to be quiet.
နော်ဂီလေယောခိုဒိုလောမခမနေ
He also says tongues is the least of all gifts.
အဝဲမေဝဲနော်မေတာကတူပလေကလိုတာကတူလေပလေမေတာဟစ်စစ်စစ်ဘုခါလောမတာဟစ်ကလာနေ
He begins chapter 13 of 1 Corinthians by writing,
13 right
chapter 13, verse 1.
အဝဲစာတော့ဝဲလာလေ
Let's say 1 through 3.
နော်အဝဲစာတော့ဝဲလာလေတဲကရီတူဒီစစ်တဲတူလေသမနော်ယမေကတူဒါလေပွာကညောတော့ကလူအပလေတဖပါစာတော့ယတဲ့အတကွီမီတိုဘာတော့ယမေဒီတော့ဘောသောအသောတော့ဒီရှယ်ရှစ်သောခခအသောနေလောတော့ယကတူဒါလေဝီအကလိုမီသီတော့ကယတာအဒိုအယိုယင်နာမေပတော့ယမေစညတာခလတော့ယမေနေဘတာခလdu yemasu ke sekelo se basa do yita eta kumito ba do yemeta klo lo do yeme helo op do yeme helo opwa ga le yita pota likhale do yeme helo ku yeno khodi so ka bata su ko ho o basa do yita eta kumito ba do yita bablu ba phole ta not mi ba
So he's saying here the more important thing is love.
No suppose te weta le rido te ne mira ta elo
If I speak in tongues but I don't have love,
no you could do that le play klo me te yita emedo ba do
then it's just noise.
no come in mita klo lo
In chapter 8 of verse 13, he says,
le asodo ko ta sitha bu ne we te we di
Love never ends.
no ta e ne te ka no blo ba
Its prophecies will come to an end.
no ta te ra le week lo ne mu ti ni ka te gu we
Tongues will cease.
no pa ka to pli klo te ba ka te we
And he finishes in verse 13.
no le ta sitha ne we ma ka te we le
Faith, hope, and love are the only thing that lasts.
no ta do ke ni ta na ta mu la ta eta kui se mi o da ta lo do do ka te le kla ni mi ta eta kui lo
And the greatest of these is love.
no ta kla ni ta eta kui lo
Now, why does Paul condemn speaking in tongues without an interpreter?
ba mu ni ko sa pa lu tho da we no ta ka to ra le ple klo ba sa do wa te klo thi no me to wa te klo ne kha me ne wa te she no me to ba ni
One of the problems in the church in Corinth
pa ta ko ta mi ta ke ko le ko ri su pu ta o ro sa ni
was disruptive worship.
no we ma ti ta we da wa ba yu a ti ta ba le ta ba yu a pu ne
Speaking in tongues,
no wa ka to ra le ple klo
the way they observe communion.
no so da le no phe wa ti me o ko da o ko bu na
I believe women speaking out and disrupting the service.
no ba se ta na le ke me we po mu ti ta pha no ko to da le ke ra wa ta ti ta le ta ba ko yu ta o ko bu da ba ko yu a ni
So Paul is saying in your church,
no so po le te wa le ne ta o phu pu ni
speaking in tongues is causing more problems than help.
no awe me ta ka to da le ple klo ni ke ra ta ko ra ke pha do
Now, why would I want to speak in tongues?
ba mu ni ko ye ba ka to da le ple klo le
Because it could demonstrate
no awe di to do ka du ne phla ro we le
that I am more spiritual
no de to ka du ne phla le ya yi no sa so si o do ya do ye kha me ye me no ye o do sa so si a ni pa ga di je ne
than other people.
no a ni pa ga di
I could be saying, look at me, I listen, I hear God,
no kwa ti ya ke ri no ye ka to da ka sa yu ha no
in a way you do not.
no le su ka to di so ya se ba si ma di se ya se ba
So it is a gift that is very easily abused.
me ta he de kha le pa no pa nyo nu ma ka su ka ma we mo
Paul says, in verse 12 of chapter 14, so with yourselves, chapter 14, verse 12, he says, you're very eager for spiritual gifts,
no the sikhi de din ne so su ge lo le su ke ne ba ta he ba kha do sa ne sta do ge lo ad ki le ge lo ad ki ta le akama tho ta o phunit ki
strive for the ones that will build up the church,
no su ge lo kha be ne ge lo le da sa ba ne ge lo le ta le tho ho mo kha be ne
that are helpful to other people.
le ke bli ke phu ke le tho ho
Oh, Paul says, I myself have spoken in tongues,
no ye no so polu de ye no sa da ne ge ye te da le plik lo
but faith, hope, and love
ba sa ro ta na ta mu la ta e
are the gifts you should seek.
no le ne ka ba khu
Also, he says,
no wa te se ko we le
again in chapter 13,
no se phe te si te bu ni no kho si te bu ni
verse 8,
le sa po kho ni
but as for prophecies, they will come to an end.
no ta eta kui ni to lo tu ka ba mi me ta ka to le wi aklo ka pu kui do play de pha ka so ti we do ta si nya ka pu kui lo
And as for tongues, they will cease.
no ka play klo ka te wi no
So some people have said
do pat no te we di
that prophecy and tongues
ta ka to ra le wi klo play klo ni
were temporary gifts
me we ta he to so to lo
for a certain period of time,
no me we phe ta se ka to
and then they have passed away.
no le ki ni ka te wi la wa ta na te je ne
I know people who speak in tongues,
ta si nya pa le ka to ra le play klo to no
and for them, it's a good experience.
no wa se ko ni me ta le kho pro le agi lo
And I say, okay, good for you.
no ta te la okay le no ga gi lo me ta gi lo mo no
The chairperson of my deacon board in Ohio at my church
no ta pa la se no le no we kho te ga le o hai ta phu ni
said he had spoken in tongues,
awa te le we ka to ra le play klo
and it was helpful and encouraging to him.
no we no mi we ta le ke ta ma se le ke hi gi ba da go
But he never did it in worship.
no ba sa we ta ma we le ta ba no de blo ba
He never did it in public
အဝတ်တမလေးပွားမညာနော်ဘလပါ
because he said it was not helpful to anybody else.
နော်အဝတ်တေဝရအတကေဘလေးပွားက not ကပါတေဝ
And so he followed the teaching of the Apostle Paul
အဝတ်မဝဒီစပလူအတဆုလို့ဆိုလော
and just did it privately on his own.
နော်အဝတ်မဝဒလေအကချတကကောလေနော်လေသနဒဝဲလေကစားဒဝဲလော
Steve McKee. Wonderful man, you know.
မင်းအဝတ်ပြပွားလောလာတကလော
So there's nothing wrong with speaking in tongues.
နော်နကတော်လေပလိကလို့နေအတဘေတကမပါ
I've never done it.
ဘာသာသတ္တမနော်ဘလောသမတနေ့သတ္တမနော်ဘလောပါ
I've never been any place where people did it,
နော်သတ္တလေတူလေပွားလေပွားလေအမဝဲတိဖာနေအကလာသတ္တလေတူနော်ဘလောစစ်ကိုပါ
and it was interpreted.
နော်မေတမီလေနော်တာတက်လို့ထီပါနေ
So it's part of some people's tradition.
မေဝဲပတ်တနော်ကနေမေဝဲဒီဆိုဝတိမဝဲဒီအလူအလားဆုံးပါနော်
Does that answer your question?
စီစက်တဒီကွာကြာနော်
I don't argue with people about it.
နော်သာပွာလေတဲဒီနေစစ်ဖာဒီသတ္တရီလို့နော်ဘလောကျေပါမ
If somebody says, I speak in tongues,
ပတ်မေတေသတ်တကကလေသကတူရလေပလိကလို့
and I say, do you find that helpful?
သာဒီကွာလောအကဲဘလစစ်ကိုဟာလေနော်နေ
And if they say yes,
အဝဲမေတေလေမေရော
I say, okay.
နော်တတဲလေရီလော
But if somebody is doing it just to demonstrate
နော်မေပတ်တနော်နေအဲ့ဒိုလေပတ်တဲ့အဲ့ဒိုကြွားလောမနော်အဲ့ဒိုပဲပါ
how,
စာရတာ
how spiritual they are,
လေအဝသိအဝသိမြေပွာလေဟိုတော့နော့သခမင်းနော့သချုထဲလေနော်
how close to God they are.
အဝသိကျေဘူးတော့ကစားရဘူးတော့ကစားထဲလေနော်
I think, I wonder why you're doing this.
ဘယ်တကချုံမလားတကချုံမလေသသဘူးဘမ်နုခနမကြိုင်လေနော်နမကြိုင်ဘမ်နုခလေ
Now, lastly, there is in some Pentecostal churches
နော်ပကတဲလေအလခိကတဲနေနော်သဆောစီနော်သဆောစီတရတနော်နေ
they believe
အဝသိနာဝဲလေ
you are not really saved
နော်နေတနေဘတာဥကိခောကိနော်နော်ဘာ
until you have spoken in tongues.
နမေတတေရာလေပလစ်လို့မေတဘာဝမေတသေးပါနေတနေတာကိခောကိနော်နော်ဘာတဲ့
And I say to them,
နော်သတေဘာသတေဝသိလေ
I completely reject that.
ဒါခမဲတတူလို့သေးပါမနော်
You want to speak in tongues, fine.
နော်တေရာလေပလစ်လို့မေသိနေဂီလော
But people who don't speak in tongues
နော်ပလေတေရာလေပလစ်လို့သေးပါဟောနေ
are just as saved as you are.
နော်အဝဲနေမတောက်ကိခောကိဒီနေတော့လောခမဲ
So, does that answer your question?
နော်
But 1 Corinthians 13 and 14 is where Paul addresses that.
နော်မေတာကိကောအနေစပလူဝဲဘရှေဝဲဘဘွားရှေဝဲဖဲဝဲကွက်ကဝဲလက်တက်ကရီစစ်တစီလူဘူးနော်
Okay. Let's say one other thing about the book of James,
နော်ပကတဲတက်ကေနော်ဆိုရကိုအတက်ကွက်တခါ
and we're circling back to something we've already talked about,
နော်တော့ပကိဒါကလေတာရစ်တနော်လေပတဲအောင်စစ်ဖာနေ
because I want to make sure we understand it.
နော်ပဲဒိုနပ်ပဲဒိုလေဖီနာပွအော်နော်
In chapter 2,
Let's
verses 20 through 26. I'm sorry.
Sabuki
James chapter 2,
James chapter 2 နော်ဆိုရကိုကိုခီ
20 to 26.
ခီစီတူခီစီခူ
Yako, I know.
yeah ရကိုခီစီတူခီစီခူနော်ဘာသာတော့ပတ်တကိုတသောဘတ်တကကတမတဖတ်တူဘတော့တန်နာမေကေတသီနေမေတမိုစညာနသစစ်ကွာပပဆောဘရဟပါထောထောအဖို့ခွာဆောဣစလေတလူအဖို့ခုတော့တပတော့ပလောအလေတမတဖအခိုတမေပါနတိလေတန်နာမခုတော့အတမတဖတော့တန်နာလေထောပွေထောလေတမတမေပါတော့လီနေလေထောပွေထောလေအစီဝဲဒါတော့ဆောအဘရဟနာယွာတော့တပကေလေတတော်တလိုလေအောတော့တကိုအလေယွာအတိတကိုလောမာတာဒီနီတော့သူထီလေပွားကညောဘာတာပါတော့ပါလို့အော်လေတမတဖအခိုတော့တမေပါထဲတနာခိုပါတော့ဒီနေ့အစောခသမနရခတကတူလို့ကလူတဖတော့မအကေကေကလေတဘိုဒါတော့ဘာစစ်ကိုတပါတော့ပါလို့အော်လေတမတဖအခိုတမေပါအဂေဒီနောက်ခိုတူအဘတော့စာနေမေတ္တာစီအစောနေတနာတူအဘတော့တမတဖမေတ္တာစီစေကိုဒီနေ့ဆိုလော
One of the central texts for the Apostle Paul
Sopolu atakwe no akosik dokdane
was Abraham believed God,
no so Abraham na we kasaywa
and it was counted to him as righteousness.
no do ta pa to pa lo le mi pa no pa กว่าต่อปะโล
So Paul argues Abraham was saved by trusting in God.
เนาะเพ่สปอลูเตเวเลสอับราฮัมเนาะนะนี่ตะกิก็กิครบเลยอันหนักไซว่าโค
And that was before Moses and the Jewish law.
เว้ยโอเตเลเนาะเวสเวว่ายูดาโพตัสตาซอเลลิโบเชปู
So Paul argues to his Jewish opponents
เนาะเพ่สปอลูริโลบอลโลดอกว่าเนาะว่ายูดาโพเลทอดาเสพานี่
faith came before the law.
เนาะตันนะเว้เฮโอโชบาเจเลตันเจ้าตาสอตโอบาลีสอับราฮัมอัตันนะเว้เนาะสอับราฮัมนะโชบาเจได้แต่คือเลสอโมชินนี่ตาสอสอบาเจลี
So James says, let's take another look at Abraham.
เนาะเพ่สอยากูสิกเตเวเกบกว่าโดเลสอับราฮัม
He offered up his son Isaac.
เนาะเวเลลุทออโพสออิเซ
So his faith was active along with his works.
เนาะอัตนาเวอัตนาเนาะอัตมาเคมาสกุโลตาเนาะเอาเวโออัตนาเนาะดบล็อกเอาเวมาเวสิโก
His works brought his faith to completion.
เนาะเอาเวอัตมาเนี่ยดูเลรอเปทออัตนาเลเนาะก็เลเปก็
And then in verse 24, he says, you see that a person
เนาะเพ่คือซิลุเนี่ยเดเนี่ยที่ว่ากันยอที่เลว่ากันยอ
is justified by works and not faith alone.
เนาะบัตตาปาตอปาโลเลตามาตะพะโคดอตมีบัตเทเลตานาโคบา
That is the problem with the book of James.
เนาะเวมีเวตาก็ผัดโดเลเนาะลิยากดเบปูลอ
It looks, if all we had was the book of James,
เนาะตาเลปอเลลิยากดเบปูตาเลโอดเซนพานี่
we might have a different understanding of salvation.
บาเซนเมโอเทลิยากดเบลอมเนาะสปอลูตาก็เบดูว่าเป็นกนาเปเลเนาะตาสุตานาตานี่ตาข้อกินเนี่ยเลกลอทอกันบาเซซิบาปู
But we have the whole New Testament.
ภาษาดิบเตสปูดอลิซอซีเนาะฟอตะกตรูดอตะกตรูคนนี้
And we have to read James along with the Apostle Paul.
คนนี้บ้าผ่าเวลิยากเวนี่นะบ้าผ่าสเตรคืออดอซอปอลูตาเกวติพาลอ
And when you put James and Paul together,
เพนผ่าดอนปาผู้เวสปอซอยากูตาเกวดอสปอลูตาเกวตะปูคอบลอนี่
James is trying to correct a misunderstanding of the Apostle Paul.
ปะสิญญาเกี่ยวลอที่เลยไม่เวซอยากูเวเวเกวบ้ากี่เวคอมเมนต์เกวแชร์กี่เวเลยว่าเลยอันนาเปกมาสปอลูตาเกวเนาะผ่าเวทุทอคอมยอกมาสิพาเนี่ยก็ลอ
Well, let's not just say a misunderstanding.
เนาะปกติเลยปกติเลยแต่ไม่นาเปกมาว่า
Let's say an abuse of Paul's teaching.
เขาเลยปกติเลยเนาะมาตรว่ากกูเลยมาตรมาเขาไม่เนี่ยเนาะปกติชูเผาหมอปกติเนาะมาหากว่าเวหมอแต่มาหากว่าสปอลูตาเกว
To say I have faith in Jesus Christ,
เตเลปเตเลเนาะอยู่อดตานาเล็กไซชิคริบู
but I can live any way I want.
เนาะเดี๋ยวอยู่อดตานาเล็กไซคริบูผู้นี่อยู่ก็อมูกว่าเลยเอ็ดอมูนี่อยู่อมูเซกว่าเลยเตลอซาชมูลอซาจานี่เสพานี่
James is saying that's not really true.
เนาะสปอลูซอยาก็เอ็ดเตเลดาเวนี่ดิเตเมบาตาดินี่เตเมบาตาดินี่เสพาเตเมบา
If you have a living faith,
เนี่ยเมอดตานาเลมูเวนี่
then God will be working to change your life.
เนาะก็ซาอยู่อ่ะเนาะก็สอดเลนตาอมูเลนก็อมูเลเคลบาล
So we have to balance James with Paul.
ก็ลิเปเรเลซอยาก็ตาเปเรซอปอลูเนี่ยบกบะเนาะโทคัวเนาะบะโทคัวเกี่ยว
Okay? That's
เว้ยไม่ได้
That's James.
เนาะเว้ยไม่ได้ซอยาก็ตาเปเรบุลอ
any questions?
ที่กว่าวะพอหรือวะวะ
Cái đó đi qua mấy đó đi qua tận
เม
nó có đòi cái tập còn là đá thì kia đá thì đó mà cũng bao nhiêu nó cũng phải con thì nó thì nó chứ mà tập còn đá đó đó thì kia mà bao nhiêu đó thì chúng mình ya sao cái này chúng mình là thìไม่ปัญหาได้ป่ะภาษาต่างกันเนี่ยจะเดี๋ยวก็ต้องมุ่งปุ่นนี่มากีตาร์นี่บ้านลิมอนเราเดี๋ยวโลกปัญหาได้ป่ะมั้งเราดูเดี๋ยวเราไม่ว่าสุกินนักกีตาร์กันจะพูดว่ามากีตาร์เดี๋ยวเราจะมาตะโกนเราดูมึงจะจะฟีลบ้านมั้งคนเนี่ยปัตตาเนี่ยก็ที่ว่าแล้วแต่เจอใครแล้วแต่ชั่วโมงก็พอคนมั้งเดี๋ยวติงอย่างจริง
She have a question that she have a friend co-worker in workplace in this country. They are very educated people. They are very educated people, but they don't have faith. They are not maybe they are not believer, but they said in our life, is the matter is only if we do good is enough for everything. So she's struggling with this. When she heard this one, she's struggling because as a believer, she said we have to believe and we have to have faith. But these educated people and co-workers said the matter is only if we do work is enough.
The Apostle Paul would say no.
တာကတဲ့နာလေဒီစပေါ်လူတဲ့အတဲဆိုတော့တစ်သေးပါမှာတစ်သေးပါမှာနော်
There is one passage
နော်လစ်ဆော့စီအိုဝတ်တဆာတဲ့လား
in Matthew chapter 25.
လီမာသဲခီစီယေ
In chapter 25, it looks as if Jesus is talking about the judgment of the Jewish people.
ဒီမှာသဲခီစီယေနေမေဝဒါကဆာရှုခရီအဝဲကစညောဝဲဒါပွာယူနော်ပွာယူဒါပိုတိပါ
People who have heard the good news of Jesus Christ.
နော်လေပွာလေအနာဟူဘာနော်တသခိကဆောလေမေအနာဟူဘာကဆာရှုခရီအဂေတသခိကဆောဝဲပွာလေအနာဟူဘာတိပါနေ
And then in verse 31,
နော်လေဆပုသစစ်တဘူးနေ
Jesus talks about the judgment of the goats and the sheep.
နော်ကဆာရှုခရီတေဝဒါလေမုန်ခိကတတကနော်ဖာဝဲသိုးတော်မတလေ
He says, you sheep go over there, you goats go over there.
နော်သိုးတဲ့ဖာနေလေလေဤသိုးတဲ့ဖာလေလေဤမေမတလေနေအိုလေဤ
He says to the sheep,
အဝဲတေဝဒါသိုးတဲ့ဖာနေဒီ
come inherit the kingdom prepared for you.
သဟိနေနော်မုခဘောဘူးလေတကတဲ့ကတော့ပါနေသိဝရကေ
I was hungry and you gave me food.
ယေသာဝီသာတော့သိဒီအော်ယာ
I was a stranger and you welcomed me.
ယမေပတ်သမွေတော့သိတူလို့ယာ
I was in prison and you visited me.
ယောလေခုပူတော့သိဟာအိုကိုယာ
And the people say, the sheep say, when did we ever do that?
နော်ဖက်နေသိုးတဲ့ပွာလေတနော်ဖာလေသိတဲ့ဖူးနေတေဝဒါပန်ကဆာရကဆာခရီပမာဘာနာဖဲလေပတိတိမလေပမာဘာနာကျန်နေ
And he says to them, when you did it to the least of these around you, you did it to me.
နော်ဖက်နေကဆာခရီတော့သီမာဘာပွာလေအစိကတက်တကနေမေသီမာဘာယာလော
And then he turns to the goats.
နော်ဝဲခါခဆူမတလေအိုတဖူးနေတေဝဒီ
In this story, you don't want to be one of the goats.
နော်လက်တခဲပူဒီယနာလေသိတဲ့အဲ့တော့ကဲမတလေပါမော
He says, I was hungry, you didn't feed me.
နော်ယအဝဲတေရဝမတလေသိဖိုင်ဖဲယသဝိနေသိတူအော်ယာပါ
I was thirsty, you gave me nothing to
နော်
drink.
ဖဲယသူဝိသစေနေယသသူသာလက်ထီနေသိတူအော်ယာနော်မီပါ
I was naked, you gave me nothing to wear.
ယအိုဘေစေနေသိတူကူဒဆိုယာနော်မီပါ
I was in prison, you did not visit me.
ယအိုလခုဘသိတဲ့ဟာအကိုယာပါ
And the goats say, well, when did we ever see you? We didn't do those things.
နော်ဖဲနေဝမတလေဖိတဲ့ဒကစခရဘတိတိဘူးနာကြနော်ဘလေတိဘူးနာဘလောနော်ဂျန်နေချီလော
And Jesus said, when you did not do this to the least of those around you, you did not do it to me.
နော်ဖဲနေစခရတဲ့သီမတမဘာပွာအစိကတက်တကလေသီဆိုသီကလာနေမေရာဒီဆိုသီတမဘာယာဆိုလော
Now, some people would say
နော်ပတနော်ကတေဝဒီ
that after talking about the judgment of people who have heard the news of Jesus Christ,
နော်ပတနော်ကတေဝဖဲပနော်ဖဲပနဟူဘကဆာရှုခရီအဂေလေမေဝမစညောနီတာဂေဝေနေ
then Jesus turns to talk about the judgment of those
နော်ဝဲနကစခရီခတ်ရီတော့တဲနော်မစနော်တာမတီနီလက်တက်စညောဝသိနေ
who have never heard the good news of Jesus Christ.
နော်လေအတနာဟူဘကစခရီအဂေနော်ဒဘလတာခရီဆောအဂေနော်ဒဘလဘာတိဖာနေ
So you could say, in this parable,
နော်ပကတဲလေတာခေပူဖေပူနေ
people are being judged based upon whether they did good works or not.
နော်ပတနော်ဖဲတာဖဲနေနော်ပတနော်တိပတိဖာနေတာနော်တာစညောကဘလေအမာဂီဒါတမာဂီဒါကျတဲ့
Paul also, early on in Romans,
နော်လေစပေါ်လူအတက်ကွယ်ဘူးလေရိုမေပူအတော့ခုနေ
says the Gentiles who had never heard the law of Moses
နော်ပွာတခေါ်ပေါ်မှုဖို့အတနာဟူဘာတသခိဆောနော်ဒဘလတိဖာနေ
did the things of the law
နော်အဝသေအိုမူဒီတသောသော
out of an internal sense of right and wrong.
နော်အဝသေစညာဝဲတာအဂေတာဘာနေဝသေစညာဝဲ
Those are some passages
နော်အိုလီဆိုစီအိုတနော်လေ
that might address
လေအဝဲကတေဘာပွာလေ
what happens with people
le pa muni ki ta pa se pa le ta ka ma sa do di le ne
who have never heard the gospel.
le atana hu ba ta sa ki so not the blow ba le ta ki kho ki ri not the blow ba ne
But those are not your friends at work.
ye chomo ri na sa ko se pa ne ri atame le pa class le atana hu ba ta sa ki so not the blow te mi di ni ba na hu ba we
Some people are what they call universalists.
pa ta no ne pa ko le universal kame ne pa kame ne pa khal ne ba ta ki kho ki kame khal ne ba ta ki kho ma ja ne ma
Which means that everybody will be saved.
nó bắt đầu nó về le nó để hết cái nó bảo có bơi này muốn đi khi cái này này cái này bắt đầu cái có cái khó là nó một bắt đầu nó nào vậy này
It's hard to make a case for that from the Apostle Paul.
bác sao à về này đi le sập lửa qua đi và chúng tôi đi có đâu mà sập lửa tu lửa vào mà chân này và cố gắng để muốn đi khi cái này cái có cái lo này sập lửa tu lửa vào mà ta thi ta sẽ ra đi này
When I was in Belgium,
thế nếu mà ta khi cái nó đồ le ta ở le Belgium khá đấy
the father of one of our younger son's friends
nó ba đứa cái le mình về nó ta phụ ở cái cột được không
bought me a cup of coffee in a train station one time
nó về bữa đó ta coffee le mình uống thế này
and said, I have a question.
nó về xí qua ta sao được ta sao được ta xí qua tụi mình
Something's been bothering me,
le ta xí qua ta khai ta chúng tôi khai mà tita la nó cái đó ta tita le ta có
and I just have to ask you.
nó ta ở xí qua na
So now, I'm an atheist.
ta mê qua tên na yêu được hả
I don't believe in God.
ta tên na cái sao yêu ba
I know that you're a Christian
ta xin nhận mê qua kripo
and you believe in God,
nên na cái sao yêu ba
and that's okay.
ba sao đó lo atwa do ba
You know, I don't think you're dangerous.
ta thi na lên de lopli lopu ne ke ta có ra ke ba
We Belgians are very open people.
nó về cái bộ Belgium phone pe mê qua le tu lo khosera se khelo lo
But why would someone like you believe in God?
qua cái nhớ đi số nào ba mình có ba na yêu le ta xí qua ta
He had looked at me and saw we have a lot in common.
nó ở đây na đây pata ba pa kame ne pata di solo sa mo pata chai lo sa pata ba sa di solo sa o ama lo sa o ama
I did not appear mentally ill.
nó yete kame ne ya do plan le ba kuno ha wa de me ba
And he was really perplexed. He was really curious.
nó awe sa kame ne awe sai wizai sa do ma
Now, I could have read the Bible to him.
nó sa pha ne li so si te se ba
He wouldn't have believed a word of that.
bam le awe tan na li so si no to ba ko ne me pha na na ke tan na wa ko ne
I could have talked about theology with him.
ta ka te pya le theology ka sa yo me da chai ta ka te pya yo thu gi yo ko le do tho de sa te se ba
He would have said, yeah, I don't believe a word of that.
nó awe cái tê lo awe cái lo awe để mấy cái nào vậy ba
So what I said to him was,
ta le ta tê ho đi
I exercise faith in Jesus Christ.
nó ta ô đỏ tan na le cái sa siêu kripu
It changed my life.
nó le ta tan ta ô đỏ tan le ta ô mu le tan na le cái sa siêu kripu cho le ta ô mu
It's given me purpose and direction in my life.
nó hết ta ô mu khom nyo đỏ ta cái ba ô mu đi le ne cái nó ta ô mu ô đỏ khom nyo le ta có
And I can't imagine my life without faith in Jesus.
ta chom mu la sa le ta me to ô đỏ tan na le cái sa siêu kripu ta chom mu ta ô mu ka ma ta đi le ta chom mu bu ba ta ba
It's been a really good thing for me.
đó mi về ta không nhớ gì đó mi về ta le ô đó không nhớ gì le ta có lo ta đó
And I love to see other people have the same experience.